Good afternoon, everyone. I'd like to welcome you to the Métis Research Rendezvous. To begin with, I'm going to call upon Senator Bob McKay to bring us an opening prayer. Senator Bob.
Not tours? Can you hear me?
Yes.
Are you sure you can hear me? How about you, Chris? Okay. Okay, this little prayer I'm going to do is a kind of a universal prayer with the children of the world. And it is fairly sad, but it's true. So I'm going to start now. Mighty Spirit, hear our prayer for the children who live in a world where every day is a violent one. We pray for those who stare at photographers from behind barbed wire, who can't run down the street in new sneakers, who have never played hockey or soccer, who were born in places we wouldn't be caught dead, who never get to go to a circus or school, who live where shooting occurs daily. We pray for the children who bring us sticky kisses and a handful of dandelions, who hug us in a hurry and forget their lunch money, who throw tantrums in the grocery store and pick at their food, who never rinse the tub or get a visit from the tooth fairy, who don't like to be kissed in front of their friends, who squirm in church or temple and fight with their siblings, whose tears can sometimes make us laugh, and whose smiles can make us cry. Mighty Spirit, we pray for those whose nightmare comes in the daytime, who will eat anything and have never seen a dentist, who are spoiled by anyone and who go to bed crying from hunger and pain inflicted upon them, who live and move but have no being. We pray for the children who want to be carried and those who must be, who we never give up on, and for those who get a second chance, for those we smother with kisses and those children who will grab the hand of anyone kind enough to offer it. Mighty Spirit, we ask you to protect all the children from danger and keep them forever in your care. Amen. With rich mercy and thank you.
Okay, I'd now like to call upon Dr. Vice President of Research, Economic and Innovation, to bring opening remarks on behalf of Lakehead.
Thank you very much. President Limpinski, Senator McKay, respected guests, Lakehead students and researchers, ladies and gentlemen, welcome to Lakehead University. At this morning's research rendezvous with the Metis community, Dr. Brian Stevenson, the president of Lakehead University, forwarded his welcome remark and outlined Lakehead's commitment to the Metis community to education, research, and economic development frontlines. To keep in the same line, I would like to again call your attention on two very important documents. The first one is a Memorandum of Understanding signed on September 2011 between Lakehead University and the Metis Nation of Ontario, which really guide a working, respectful, and sustainable relationships between the partners, including the important research collaborations. The second document is just passed by Lakehead University Senate, which is the Lakehead University strategic plan for the next 5 years. The plan confirms that one of our research priority at Lakehead University is First Nations, Metis, and Inuit research. These two documents, one's the internal document, one's the partnership document, really highlight the prominence of the Aboriginal research at Lakehead University and the critical importance of this research to the future of this university and the future of Aboriginal communities. At Lakehead University, we have more than 30 leading researchers involved in research projects and partnership with Aboriginal communities. The research scope encompasses the revitalization of Aboriginal language, education, culture, self-governance, northern ecosystems, and the interaction of humans and the environment. For example, Dr. Judy Isaac, one of our Canada research chair in Indigenous knowledge and research, has been working on the Metis history by producing films on storytelling and history. Another example of Metis research is the work by Dr. Sandra Wolf, and she worked very closely with pre-service teachers. Looking back, for the many years of research activity at Lakehead University, we have been doing great. But we know we can do even better with extensive and more broadened collaboration with Metis community. This morning's research workshop and continue to this afternoon's panel discussion would have provided a greater context and understanding of Metis issues to both Lakehead and Metis communities. Together, we can identify challenges and search for solutions, and Lakehead can better support Metis people's aspiration for an improved quality of life in their communities. Thank you very much for coming to Lakehead University. Thank you for all your support and collaboration on the very important issues that matter to both Lakehead University and to our Metis communities. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I now like to call upon President Gary Lipinski, President of the Métis Nation of Ontario, to bring opening remarks.
Thank you, Dr. Wong, and on behalf of Dr. Stevenson for bringing opening remarks and for making Métis Nation of Ontario and our citizens and our community members, not only that are here today, feel welcome, but also for those students that enjoy Lakehead University as their choice of educational facility. I would perhaps begin by saying that the relationship that's developed with Lakehead University and Métis Nation of Ontario perhaps began in September when we did sign the memorandum of understanding, which was referred to by Dr. Wong, but I think I'd rather phrase it like this. It's been the most recent chapter in the relationship, the long-standing relationship we've had with Lakehead this past September, to continue to advance what I would say is a long-standing relationship with Lakehead University for quite some time. The Métis Nation of Ontario has always put a lot of emphasis and pride in promoting our Métis students and Métis learners to achieve the best they can be, to be all they can be, and we put a great deal of emphasis on promoting post-secondary education. In fact, it goes to one of our core and fundamental objectives in one of our foundational documents, which we call a Statement of Prime Purpose, and it articulates the emphasis we put on promoting post-secondary education. And almost since the beginning, when the Métis Nation of Ontario was formed as a representative government, a voice for Métis people in Ontario, we began setting about scholarship and bursary enhancements to help support Métis learners who attend post-secondary institutions. And we're very proud to have some 32 of those relationships across the province of Ontario. And certainly Lakehead was one of the main universities and institutions at that time. We have since then continued to move forward that relationship, and certainly with the signing of the MOU, we brought it to a new level of commitment, to say that we need to look at deliverables, and deliverables that we can objectifiably verify and measure. And so we're very interested in seeing how many students are attending Lakehead University, the success rates, and again working collaboratively with not only Lakehead but all institutions to do whatever we can do to collaborate, to work together to make sure that they have the best opportunities to be as successful as they can be. And so This panel discussion that we're having here today is a part of that MOU, part of that relationship to create greater awareness of Métis students, Métis contributions, Métis rights, Métis issues. And so I think you're going to be, in fact I know you're going to be very impressed with the panel that's been selected here today. The panel will be made up of, without question, the most prominent and best legal minds and Métis lawyers in Canada, who are the most knowledgeable about current Métis law and Métis law that is working its way through the courts. You will also be, I think, very impressed by some of the other panel members who are very intricately involved in ongoing Métis research and data collection to help tell the Métis story. And so certainly for Métis people, for the Métis Nation of Ontario, that's always been one of our challenges is to not brought to the forefront. And so we're going to do whatever we can do to proud of our contributions we've made both historically and contemporary, and look forward to the youth of today, the Métis youth of today, taking their rightful place within the work profession, within society, and continue to contribute to the building of our communities, provinces, and countries. We're very grateful for this relationship we have with Lakehead. It's a strong relationship. I know this is being webcast to communities not only across Ontario, but I would suspect internationally, potentially even the world, as well as your offsite campus in Aurelius.
So my name is Karen J.
Thanks, everyone. I hope everyone can hear me. And then when you start there, where you can only go down, so that's been the problem. I'm going to speak a little bit about, President Lipinski spoke about the Métis, need for the Métis to tell their story. And I, along with Jean Taillet and Clément Chartier, have had an opportunity to do that in many cases since Pauli, in the courts where Métis finally get to tell their story. And I think from those experiences, I sometimes feel that I've turned into a quasi-historian and getting a real sense of the larger story that isn't often told. And I think the larger story that isn't often told, and I will say this, is that I think that for the most part, the Métis narrative or Métis history has largely been untold because it's been ignored, or the perspective has been written from, largely driven by a focus on First Nations. And so when you're focusing on one people, you often don't see the others that are around. And so I was often shocked by people who go, well, you know, those Hudson Bay records, they don't talk about the Métis. They talk about Indians. They talk about others, but the Métis aren't in there. And the reality that I think has come since Pauli is that we've been able to actually have those records or those documents looked at again from a Métis perspective. And I think it's an exciting area of research, and I think it's a new area of research, and I think that it's an area that is only going to continue to develop. I think the other problem that I have saw with Métis history was that it was by and large written from a Red River myopia, that we began and we ended all in the Red River. And the reality is that it is only one piece of the story of the Métis people within this country. It's a very exciting piece, it's a sexy piece. Riel was a very controversial figure, but the reality is that all roads did not lead to the Red River, all roads did not lead from the Red River. There is a fundamental story to be told from Ontario westward that spans what was referred to as the historic northwest of the Métis, that goes into the United States as well, that hasn't been told. And I think that through, unfortunately, litigation sometimes, that's where we're slowly putting some of the pieces to the puzzle. We're filling out that narrative and recognizing that Riel, the story of Riel and the story of what happened in the Red River is only a sliver of the fascinating story of the Métis people within this country. So I'm going to talk a bit today about that larger narrative to just give some context, and then I'm going to focus in on the area that we know in and around the Lakehead area, because I think it's a fascinating story and it's tied to that larger narrative. But most importantly, I think that we often get opportunities to speak at different universities, and so it's always nice to make the presentations tailored to who we're talking to today, or to give some geography that'll be relevant to the individuals that are listening in today and also in the audience. So I'm going to start by talking about Ontario's other Aboriginal people, the Métis story. And so the Métis were the children of the fur trade and marriages between Indian women and the voyageurs, usually Ojibwe, Cree, and Dene. So successive generations of intermarriage created a unique culture in the Northwest, and ethnogenesis occurred, which means birth of a culture, between the late 1700s and the early 1800s throughout the Northwest. And I think the important point that we learned from the Pauli case, but we also learned from the research, is that ethnogenesis is not the thing that it's like nails on a chalkboard for me when someone says, well, the first Métis appeared 9 months after they hit the beaches on the East Coast. And that is absolutely wrong. It's actually insulting to Métis people. It undermines the idea that a distinct people with their own culture, language, traditions emerged. And that doesn't happen overnight. And it happens, and I think that what is important to understand, and I think the Métis have long said that, is that we aren't just mixed ancestry people. We come from historic communities that emerged before Canada was Canada, and those are what is protected, and those are the Métis communities that are protected within Canada's Constitution. But I think it's an important point to recognize, because much of the literature, some of the literature previously was, well, we're just looking for mixed ancestry people, and that's just simply not the case. So when we're talking about the Northwest, what is generally the Northwest? Well, Northwest is a perspective. It's not an exact geographic area, but it's a perspective from Toronto and Montreal of everything that is north and west. And so you look up here, and my laser isn't working. Of course it's not. But if you look up here, it's a general area that wasn't open for settlement. And I think that this is the area that the Métis, by and large, emerge in, and they emerge in it because they're. I use language that probably sociologists would not agree with or not use, but it's an area where the Métis were able to incubate to a certain extent, undisturbed, for a series of generations to develop that unique identity, culture, and not be absorbed or not be subsumed into the dominant European culture or the First Nations cultures. And I think that only happens, and what we see in the historic record is that really only happens in a specific geographic area because of the circumstances that arise and because of the policies of non-settlement in the Northwest for a period up until at least the mid to late 1800s. So I think it's important also that the Supreme Court of Canada recognizes that this is, trying to figure out what this is, that the Supreme Court of Canada also recognizes these are the people that are actually protected within Section 35. So this is a quote from Cowley. It says, "The inclusion of the Métis in Section 35 represents Canada's commitment to recognize and value the distinctive cultures, Métis cultures, which grew up in areas not yet open to colonization and which the framers of the Constitution Act 1982 recognized can only survive if the Métis are protected along with other Aboriginal communities." And so where is that not yet open to colonization? Well, that's in the historic Northwest Territory. And so what we begin to see in the record, and I can tell you I'm kind of moving forward, it's like Métis history in 30 minutes, but what you begin to see in the historic record is people ask, well, what are we looking for? And what are the facts that you're looking for? Well, the facts that you're looking for, and it's quite interesting, is that you have the initial progenitor generations, and they're referred to as freemen or traders. So freemen are essentially the men that may have worked for the Northwest Company or may have worked for the Hudson Bay Company, and they are released from their contract, and as opposed to going back up to, or their contract ends, and as opposed to going back to the Orkney Islands or to merry old England, they stay. And many of the reasons of why they're staying is they have taken a mate and they have children, or there's a reason that they stay within the when they're released from their contracts. And so often you see, well, so-and-so, the freeman, and so essentially where it comes from is he's a free man. He's no longer under contract. And so these freemen essentially begin to have relations and also begin to have families that are not necessarily completely tied to the Northwest Company or the Hudson Bay Company, and begin to actually have rather large families in some circumstances. And so what the historians that have done work in this area begin to see is that, well, in the mid to late 1700s, you see references to these freemen. Then, beginning in the late 1800s, or the late 1700s or the early 1800s, you begin to see them talking about the freeman and his son, and his family and his wives. And then you begin to actually see a complete change in the language of how they're described. They're described that they're no longer extensions of the freeman or the non-Aboriginal progenitor generations. They're described as so-and-so the half-breed, so-and-so the Canadian, so-and-so the Bois Brûlé. You begin to see that they garner their own descriptor in the record, and they're not just seen as extensions of their European ancestors or as extensions of their First Nation forebears either. And so Métis ethnogenesis in Ontario, and I want to say this, I've gone to many meetings and sessions of going, we've looked at the Hudson Bay Company records and we don't see the word Métis in them at all, so there can't be any Métis in Ontario. And the reality is that if you're looking for the word Métis in the historic records in Ontario, more likely than not, you're not going to find it. But what you do find is the terms half-breed, Bois Brûlé, Canadian. I've seen everything from Frenchified Indian, which I don't even know what that means, and all of these different terms in order to describe these people. But you will not see the term Métis, and that doesn't mean that the people aren't there, and it doesn't mean that they aren't Métis today. What you more often see is Canadian, Bras-Boulés, Chicot, French Indians, Canadian inhabitants, Northmen, country-born, Indian voyageurs. And while they are closely tied to the Indian population as well, the fur trade companies, they're increasingly recognized as distinct and separate. They're identified as having unique characteristics. They aren't just extensions of their relatives of the First Nation communities or of the European cultures. And so when does this ethnogenesis happen? Well, interestingly, Jean and I have had the opportunity to do quite a few of these cases since Cowley. We've been in Manitoba, Saskatchewan, and now we're at the Alberta Court of Appeal, and successfully, I might add, on most of them, except for Alberta, but we'll change that eventually. But what we begin to see is that this ethnogenesis is occurring throughout a large territory at relatively the same times. It does begin earlier in Ontario, but you actually begin to see in southwestern Manitoba by 1815, you have a people who are firmly rooted and identifying as distinctly Métis. In southwestern Manitoba, in northern Saskatchewan by 1820, and by south and central Alberta by 1817. So you begin to see this isn't just one place. This is happening in locations throughout the historic Northwest. And the other, I think, important point is that this is happening in locations throughout the historic Northwest, but they aren't disconnected from each other. In fact, they aren't islands unto themselves of essentially, they have a network and they are intrinsically interconnected. And they're interconnected by various things. So what they essentially do have, and we more often than not know the well-known settlements of where they are, Red River, Fort Edmonton, Isle La Crosse, those locations, those are bases of operation. But what these people build is they build a network. And you begin to see the network of, and what all the network is driven by and superimposed by is what Canada's about at this point in time, the fur trade. This is all about getting, I'll use Jean's line, getting beaver hats to European men in England. It's all about fashion. But it's really all about how do we continue to feed the system of the fur trade. And whether it's the boats in Ontario that get the furs out through Montreal or through Moose Factory in Fort Albany, or whether it's through how we get into the Athabasca by using the York boats to get into the storehouse of plenty for furs, or whether it's about how you get to the buffalo through using the cart trails. This is the highway. This is Highway 1. And then there's extensions from Highway 1. And I personally think when you begin to look at it and you get to step back, there is a beautiful logic to where there are these historic Métis settlements and where the Métis are, and also where the Métis aren't. And you have to begin to understand this as a larger system. And you can't see the Métis in the south as disconnected from the Métis in the north any more than you can see the Métis in the east as disconnected from the Métis in the west. There's an interdependency when you understand the relationship through a larger scale. So for example, the buffalo hunts of the south feed the pemmican that's needed in order to operate those big voyageur canoes up in the north. And this is essentially a network that you have to look at as a larger, and they aren't disconnected. So this is what the path or the network to a certain extent looks like, and of course there's probably more lines and additions to it. But the reality is that you can see how the network works. And then when you blow it, and there's different vehicles that are essentially on it. Not everyone's driving cars, right? So here I've got the York boats on the right-hand side. Of course, in Ontario, it's the canoes. And then, of course, on the prairies, it's the Red River carts. And you can see how these are all a part of the network, but they play different roles for the Métis of whether. So the significance of the buffalo and the Red River carts just don't really resonate with Métis in Ontario, but the canoes definitely do. That's it. The waterways are essentially the highways in Ontario. And so when you actually look at how this route operates within Ontario, you see from to Lac La Pluie, one of the forts, which is Fort Francis, to Fort William. Fort William, where you can go up through Lake Nipigon and get the furs out through Moose Factory, or even Fort Albany. Michipicoten is a strategic site. Sault Ste. Marie, of course, is a strategic site. And then onward and outward through the waterways within Ontario to Fort Temiskaming, Mattawa, etc. And you also, and what you have to begin to see is that this is the network that you see playing out within Ontario. And here's just some representations of what that looks like. And of course, down in the Georgian Bay area, you have many of the people who leave from Drummond Island and Michilimackinac essentially are all around Georgian Bay and the Lake Huron area. So I think some of you may have seen this map today of where the MNO's harvesting policy is based upon and where Métis assert rights and where Métis have actually proven rights, for example, in the Sault Ste. Marie area, and that modern day existence of where the rights are asserted overlaps with that historic roots. And you can see there's a natural understanding of where Métis communities historically were and where they continue to be today. So that's kind of giving you the very, 50,000 feet Métis history in 10 minutes. And now I'm going to actually speak a little bit more about the Upper Great Lakes, Lake Superior region, because I think it's a fascinating piece of the story of the Métis Nation. But it's also, I wanted to begin with that larger understanding, because this narrative that you have up in Lake Superior and Lake Nipigon and Michipicoten is not disconnected from that larger. In fact, it's an integral part to it, and you can't understand the larger without understanding that piece of it, and you can't understand the piece that happens here without understanding the larger. So and I guess this is kind of what, for the lawyers who litigate these cases, this is kind of what the Powley case requires us to prove, of saying, well, look, we've got to prove there's a historic community, we've got to prove there's a modern day community, and you've got to prove that there's a continuation between those 2 points. And so the document sources of how you tease that out of the record for the various cases, it's not all, we would love to say, well, here's the journal that tells the entire story. In fact, what the problem is that there's some of the pieces of the story are missing, some of the pieces are written by others' perspectives, and some of the pieces are essentially in other forms that you have to put them together in order to fully understand the narrative. So what we usually do within the cases with amazing experts like Quinn Jones and others who have helped us in some of the cases that we've done throughout the Métis Nation homeland, is there's different sources that you're able to look for. So in the 1790s and early 1800s, there's the HBC and fur trade records. And I often refer to as posts as these little lighthouses, right? That essentially they're these little operational fields that you can get. They can at least record who's coming in, who's coming out, because there's no one there writing the entire narrative. So now the unfortunate part of who's coming into the post, who's coming out of the post, is you don't get a complete picture. And it's also very dependent on whether you have a good recorder at the lighthouse. And also, they're often not the questions that we'd like answered today. No one's writing in a way that we want them to write in on these days. So what essentially in Métis research is the historians that work in this area are required to actually use the HBC records in a very, very different way than they've been used in the past to do research on First Nations. And so, for example, Dr. Ray, who I think has spent much of his life in the Hudson Bay Company records, has pioneered some of the work in this area of beginning to tease from those same records that people have looked at 100 times before, but they completely miss this other Aboriginal people that are in those records. And it's really the point here is that if you're not looking for them, you're never going to find them. And that's really, to a large extent, what I think that a lot of the research prior to Powley and prior to the last 15 to 20 years of research on Métis has one of the deficiencies within it. And so you also, in the early 1790s and early 1800s, sometimes get outsiders accounts. So you get people passing through and they begin to comment on these distinct people. In the mid-1800s, you still have the HBC records, but sometimes they're spotty, and unfortunately we don't have all the posts where we'd like to have them. You also have Métis beginning to push forward on their own rights assertions, and of course some of the famous ones that we know of are the Red River Rebellion and the Battle of Batoche. You have treaty negotiations, and while the Métis are not, with the exception of Treaty 3 in the half-breed adhesion to Treaty Number 3 in Ontario, while the Métis are not part of the treaties, they're usually there, and they're usually and comments in the treaty process are talking about who the Métis are, whether they're acting as interpreters or whether they're not, whether First Nations are asking for them to be able to share their annuities with their Métis relations. Those sources of those records sometimes provide vital information or helpful information on the Métis. And in addition, you have increasingly outsiders' perspectives of people traveling through on vacations or on expeditions, and they write about these new people. In the late 1800s, we see petitions from Métis, treaty annuity payments, and in Ontario, for example, one of the, I think, the key source documents that we have, especially in this area, is that Métis were, following the treaties being negotiated and signed, that Métis were able to receive treaty annuities as half-breeds, and they're identified in those annuity payment lists as half-breeds, as well as the Indians receiving the annuity payments. We have censuses in the region that begin to come out in 1871, 1881, 1891. We again have outsiders' perspectives. And then usually what happens in the cases that we do is that from the 1900s onward, we can usually put elders up on the stand, or we can actually, the community themselves can speak to what their grandparents told them or their own history to fill in that gap. Because the record largely, the historic record of HBC records, all of those other sources, really goes dead around 1900s. And we don't, but usually we're able to pick up the story from 1900 onward. So in this region, what we begin to have is a lot of different strategic locations, whether it be Nipigon House, Fort William, and those are the lighthouses that we're able to actually pull some of this information from to begin to understand who are the free traders there, who are the families that are there, what are their names, and you're able to look and see if they're repetitive through areas. So we have Nipigon House, Poplar Lodge, Long Lake, Lesser Long Lake, Pitt, Post, and of course, Red Rock. And so looking at the Hudson Bay records, and I think, as I said, this is looking at the Hudson Bay records in a different way. You aren't looking for the term Métis, and you aren't just looking for what are the Indians doing, you're actually looking for what are the other people doing in this. So this is just an example of Fort William in 1831 to 1832. So they're talking about Michel Collins and his family and Alex Sabatson, Vizina and Tremblay, the freemen, sent off to fish at Welcome Islands with the remainder month. Deschamps and family went off to join Old Colin. And you begin to see these names that are described as freemen, or they're described as having these extended families. And that's what you're actually teasing out of the records versus just saying, well, I don't see any Métis here. And you see again, Michel Collin and Vizina with the former's family arrive. They have describing where they're going, what they've actually done. And at the bottom, you know, the women of the establishment are all off to make their sugar huts at their respective sugar bushes, also the freeman families. And so, what you start to get to see is that there's these distinct groups that they're talking about. They aren't lumping them in with the Indians, and they aren't lumping them in with the post, with the people who are working at the post. There's a distinct group that may be outside the post walls, or they may be intricately involved within it. But you do begin to see from the records that there is a distinct group there with some of the recognizable names that are part of the Métis community. So here's an example of from Nipigon House in 1828. So it's Guidon and de Tremblay. started from here to go to Michipicoten. Du Tremblay is intended to perform a fast trek to Long Lake. The other returns with the clerk, and you begin to see who is there, Cameron, Du Tremblay, Le Petrec, and you begin to figure out who these people are and what families they have, and as you begin to see successively in the records from years to years to years that they continue to exist and continue to identify as distinctly separate and apart from First Nations and also separate and apart from their European forebears. So here's just some examples of some of the men who were under contract at the Fort William in 1828, 1829. And so these are just some of the names that we see in the record that are being identified, and probably many of these names are familiar. I know they're well familiar to my clients in the Métis Nation of Ontario and their registry, of Mackenzie, Delarond, Racine, Swanson, McLeod, Deschamps, Saint Germain, Lagarde. And you begin to you begin to pick up these names in the early 1800s, and you begin to repetitively see them identified in the historic record as half-breeds, as others. Now, it doesn't necessarily mean that some of these individuals may not have joined Indian bands at later points in time, but the reality is that there's parts of these families that have always been Métis and continue to be Métis. And so what you also begin to see, and this really goes to this issue about what is a Métis community, and one of the struggles that we have with government as well as with that largely plays out in the court is this assumption of kind of going, well, in order to have a community, we need to look at a settlement, and we'll draw a little circle around it. Well, what you actually begin to see by going through the Hudson Bay Company records is you begin to see the spatial interaction of how these communities interrelate to each other. So Fort William isn't disconnected from Nipigon House, isn't disconnected from Michipicoten. And you need to begin to understand that the relationships, the trade patterns that exist, as well as the kinship patterns that exist, essentially foster a larger sense of community that isn't site-specific within the Métis context. And so here's just some of the examples of where Dr. Ray, this is one of the reports from Dr. Ray, of he's indicating from here, taking a sliver from 1828 to 1829, where is it saying that the Métis are going? And you can see that they're geographically moving within a regional territory. And here again, he takes another sliver at 1849 to 1850, and you can see that mobility continues. So it's not just an early thing, that continues throughout the generations. So here's some of the history that you see in this area. I remember I talked about those outsiders that are coming through. So here's one of the Joseph Delafield coming through in 1823, and he's keeping a diary. And he's passing from Michipicoten to Fort William. And he writes this: engagés of the Hudson Bay Company, when their term of service is expired, are called freemen. During their engagements, they are slaves in the sense that none but the Canadians could endure. In short, the more I see of these Canadian French, their mode of life in connection with the Indians, the more I feel assured that without this very race, the fur trade of the North could not be carried on. They are more hardy than the Indian, and are far more capable in the canoe, and in the winter will soon break down the Indian if traveling on snowshoes or with trains. And I would just like to say that these comments are usually just as racist towards the half-breeds in later parts, and this is no reflection of but it's a perspective of these individuals at the time, which is unfortunate, but it's also illustrates, it gives you a sense that they're coming through, and they're seeing that there's a distinct group there that aren't First Nations, and they aren't just extensions of the Hudson Bay Company or the coast. And so what you also begin to see, so that's what you see, I guess, in this area circa early 1800s, that you see the records identifying a new group of people that are either passing through or moving within the territory. And then when you really begin to see the records identify this group is when colonization begins, or essentially when settlement, they begin to allow settlement in the Northwest. And what happens is essentially the treaty-making process begins with First Nations. And that, in 1850, part of the story in Powley is, of course, the Micah Bay incident. In this area, of course, the Robinson Superior Treaty of 1850 occurs as well. And that's when you actually, and that's the implementation of the principles from the Royal Proclamation to establish relationships with the nations and tribes, and that's done through the treaty-making process. And by and large, and of course with the exception of Treaty Number 3, the Métis are excluded from that. They're there. So in the Mica Bay incident, Robinson is dispatched because the First Nations and the Métis turned the cannons on the mining company. And that's what is the impetus for Robinson being dispatched to come up and negotiate the Robinson-Huron Treaty. Well, there were Métis and First Nations that were the instigators of that. And Robinson gets up there and his response is, I'm here, I have a mandate to negotiate with the Indians. I have no mandate to negotiate with the Métis. And that begets the Powley case, essentially saying, well, the assumption was, well, one, Métis didn't have rights anyway, so you didn't have to bother negotiating with them. Or two, if they did, they were dealt with through the treaty. And what Powley clearly changes that paradigm of saying, well, no, there's existing Aboriginal rights in that area that were not extinguished or not dealt with through treaty, and they continue to exist today, and they're protected as constitutional rights, Aboriginal constitutional rights, that are equal to the rights of other Aboriginal peoples within the area. And so that whole scenario of what I think Justice McLaughlin and Vanderpeet refers to as the grand norm of settlement in Canada. So the idea that when colonization is occurring within the Northwest, it's not just a bulldozer that goes through. There's peoples there. There's peoples on the ground in possession who have inherent rights to those lands. And the government's approach in dealing with First Nations is essentially through treaty making, and for Métis, it's to largely just ignore those claims. So what you begin to have is, with the treaty-making process, Métis are there on the land as well, but they aren't dealt with through that process. And so here's Robinson recording that he's describing afterwards of in his journal of his negotiations on the Robinson Superior Treaty, and he says, when at Sault Ste. Marie last May, I took measures for ascertaining as nearly as possible the number of Indians inhabiting the north shore of the two lakes, and was fortunate to get a very correct census. I'd like to tell you, these censuses that they do are never very correct, but and I think First Nations who are engaged in treaty lands entitlements and extension of reserves processes can speak to that. And I found this information very useful at council, as it enabled me successfully to contradict the assertion made by those who were including the chiefs to resist my offer that there were on Lake Superior alone 8,000 Indians. The number on that lake, including 84 half-breeds, is only 1,240 on Lake Huron, and about 14 and 22, including probably 200 half-breeds. So he's identifying that.
Yeah, really. Here they go.
Is that time? I'm done. By the way, what time am I supposed to do?
Oh!
This is very exciting. Okay. And so here he's talking about Métis presence. Father Fremont, who's one of the Jesuit missionaries at Fort William in 1850, he's actually commenting that the Métis are there at when the treaty's being discussed, but they're passed by in silence, or they don't have the right to speak at such gatherings. And that's a quote from Father Fremont's journals. And here's kind of the Métis perspective on it. John Swanston is a HBC employee, and he's based in Michipicoten. And he knows this area well because he's traveled to it extensively. If you actually look at the Nipigon House Post and you look at the Fort William Post records, you actually see that he's repeatedly there and keeping tabs or having knowledge about who's there. And he writes this to the Governor General in 1850. He says, "At present, I'm not certain whether the government will acknowledge the rights and claims of the half-breeds to share in the payments to be made for the land about to be ceded by the Indians of Lake Superior, but should hope they would, as many would have a juster claims than the Indians. They have been born and brought up on the land, which is not the case with many of the Indians, particularly the Sioux chiefs, whose lands are situated on the American territory. So there's just the Métis perspective, and he writes extensively within his journal about how there's another group of people there that should be included, who should have their rights treated with as well. And here's just a comment later on where it's actually the Indian Commissioner in Ontario, or the Indian Commissioner in Ontario is commenting of saying, look, I've got this problem because all of these Métis, and whether they're sending me petitions or whether when the treaties are being made, there's another group there saying, well, we should be dealt with as well. And in particular, that happens in Moose Factory in a 1905 petition sent from the Métis, or Métis down in the Mattawa area. And this is the challenge that the commissioner says, is he goes, well, for those of you who are not aware, from Manitoba westward, starting with essentially the Manitoba Act in 1870, what's provided to Métis are land, as opposed to entering into treaties with them, land grants are provided, or Métis scrip is provided, and that's how Métis are dealt with in through the half-breed scrip commissions. And this is what the Indian Commissioner is commenting. He's saying the consequence of that is the half-breeds living on the Keewatin side of the English River are recognizing as having territorial rights and get scrip. Got to say that scrip wasn't a good thing for the Métis either, but that's another story. Scrip, which they may locate in Manitoba or any other part of the Northwest Territories. Well, the half-breeds on the Ontario side, who naturally come and make a claim, has been told that he has no territorial rights. We must take care to avoid the perpetuation of this. Well, they don't take care to avoid the perpetuation of that. They essentially continue, when these petitions come, they continue to send them back and forth. I think the Moose Factory petition is one of the funniest I've seen, is that, so they get it from Ontario, Ontario sends it to Canada saying, by the way, you should take a look at this. Canada then sends it back to Ontario and say, no, you should deal with this. And no one's quite sure where the petition ultimately ends up. What we can say, though, is the petition or the underlying claims and rights never get dealt with. So what we also see in this area, and I'm coming to an end, so I'm gonna move quickly through this and not go into detail, is that you continue to see these same names that you see in the early 1800s when they continue in those annuity pay lists that you see for Fort William, Red Rock, and Nipigon bands of people being identified as half-breeds. When censuses begin to, people begin to be enumerated in 1871, 1888, 1891, in Rossport, areas like Rossport, McDermott, you have the half-breeds in this area being identified as half-breeds in those census records. So here's just an example of one of them, and it'll go through and they'll be identified as an FB or for a French breed, or an EB for an English breed. And you're able to see those same names that we see early on in the 1800s continue to exist and continue to not be identified as Indians and not be identified as Europeans. Also in the 1880s in this area, I think that this is the Métis are very good. We have a long history of sending petitions. Petitions that no one pays attention to, but we send them nonetheless, which I'm always impressed with. In this area, this is one of the set of unique petitions that I've seen, is where actually the Indians and the half-breeds are sending the petitions together. And it's very interesting. One half of the side is all of these, French surnames of the half-breeds, and then on the other side, they're petitioning as, and the Indians are petitioning. So you see those sorts of things, as well as some of the reports are describe how there's this distinct group of people. They live in houses, not wigwams or huts like the Indians. They pursue a somewhat different lifestyle. They have mainly French-Canadian origins, all practicing Catholics, and they maintain their distinct surnames. And you begin to, and this is from a Boron, a Crown official, the Boron report in 1894, when he's commenting on what they found in the 1850s. And then you have continuity with what you actually have today. So you have Métis, these people don't disappear. They actually begin to participate in the commercial fisheries in Lake Nipigon or around Lake Superior. This is actually where Métis begin to politically organize in the 1950s of the predecessor organizations to the Métis Nation of Ontario, such as OMSIA and OMA. You actually see Métis organizing around Lake Superior, they forming commercial fishing associations, and that these predecessor organizations are what ultimately leads to the Métis Nation of Ontario being formed in 1993. And you'll see have a large, in continuing in this region, you have a large, vibrant Métis population that persists today, and there's their building, there's some of them participating in, I don't know what that is, but so that's, that kind of gives you, I guess, Métis History 101 in less than 30 minutes, and it's an exciting and interesting history, and I hope it actually is helpful to give some context about what work is being done, and also where Métis history and where this area of research is actually moving. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jason. Our next speaker is Professor Brenda McDougall. Professor McDougall was appointed as the inaugural chair of Métis Research at the University of Ottawa in 2010. She has worked with a number of Métis communities across Canada, documenting their cultural history and the stories of families. She began her academic career in the Department of Native Studies at the University of Saskatchewan, where she taught Native Studies for 10 years. Deeply committed to Métis communities, Professor McDougall has approached her education and training as a platform to pursue scholarship that not only reflects our understanding of the world, but also informs Canadians about Métis culture and society beyond the Red River. She is the author of several articles, and her first book, which is entitled One of the Family, Métis Culture in 19th Century Northwestern Saskatchewan, was published in 2010. Professor McDougall is recognized as one of the foremost scholars on the Métis. She is invited to speak at community, government, industry, and academic events. She sits on a number of national and provincial committees, and she oversees a number of significant research grants. In her new role at the University of Ottawa, Professor McDougall has begun to research the history of Ontario-based Métis family and community in the Great Lakes region, while also continuing her previous research associated with the Great Plains-based Métis societies. It's an absolute delight to have Professor McDougall here with us today. Please join me in welcoming Professor McDougall.
Good afternoon, and I'd like to thank the organizers for the invitation to be here today. And it's a couple of qualifiers, starting with, I do have PowerPoint, and I don't know how to work this thing. I look at the old records, so technology is not my friend. Thank you. So one of my other qualifiers is that this is what you're going to see today is a work in progress. It's really in its early stages, and my research partner is here today, Dr. Nicole St. Ange from the University of Ottawa as well, and so we worked a bit on this together, and I'm indebted to her for helping save my butt to get this ready. So the work that I do and have been doing for the last, I hate to say almost 15 years, I think, is really looking at Métis families as the foundation building block of community, and therefore the building block of culture, history, and all of these other sorts of things that we look to. And so I started doing genealogical research, not to trace any one individual line of a family, but to begin to start seeing what kinds of patterns exist in families. Do particular families intermarry with each other? Do particular groups of people work together? What's the geographic space that they operate inside of? And so we do have a range of terms that we see, sometimes we look for, and rarely hope to find. And Jason alluded to that. And part of the problem is we ask the records to tell us things, but they're not designed to tell us. A Canadian census is meant to enumerate a population so that Canada knows who those people are. A Hudson's Bay Company census is simply to enumerate its employee population and perhaps account for some of the families that are at the posts, but never to name them. And so we ask a great deal of documents, and that's not what they're designed to do. But these are some of the terms that we find. And in places like Red River, they become very specific. You see very specific terms like the French-speaking Métis, the English-speaking country-born, or the English-speaking half-breeds. So they start to break it down even more. Some census records give us even more detail, Chipewyan breeds, Cree breeds, French breeds, English breeds, these types of things, but that's rare. And if you go looking for them, you'll be disappointed by the lack of their presence. So don't be limited by what the records don't say. Pay attention to what they are saying and how they're describing things. So what I look at really is about worldview, and family itself is a worldview. How people understand their relationships to each other represents how they understand the world in which they live. Who's a brother? Who's a cousin? Who's an uncle? These terms are actually very culturally specific. They don't all mean the same things to the same people. And the relationship that they create doesn't mean the same thing in all cultures. And so you have to try and get your head into a lens that reflects the people that created the lens to begin with, and not be limited by your own cultural background. And so I'm interested in things like, are there particular sets of men and women who work together collectively? The Hudson's Bay Company records do tell us that. They list groups of people who work on the land together, women who work in fisheries together. They'll give their names. It's up to us to figure out whether or not these people are related, and if they are, what does that relationship mean? And so a Métis world very much, in my opinion, centers on family. It centers on interfamilial relationships that last generations. This doesn't happen overnight. This is a progressive, intergenerational process of building a society, incorporating new members, saying goodbye to people that leave. Because it is a fur trade world, people are posted in other regions. Families do lose connections with each other. But new people come into the region, and how do they naturalize those people into their citizenship process? How do they make those people members of the family? And so we look for types of behaviors that can be discerned out of the record groups. And so I'm going to use, from this area, Ezekiel Solomon and Louise Dubois as an example. This couple is very interesting. I would consider this, I would name these people as a foundational family, a root family for the Mackinac, Penetanguishene, Drummond Island, and Lake Nipigon regions. These people are not Métis. Ezekiel Solomon is born in Berlin. He's Jewish. He immigrates to Montreal in the 1760s. But he becomes a fur trader in the Michilimackinac area. And he goes back and forth between Michilimackinac and Montreal for most of his career. And I have seen one record that describes him as an Englishman. And this isn't a reference to his nationality. It's a reference to a language that he speaks and the fact that he's non-native. That's the reference point. His wife, Louise Dubois, is French-Canadian, born in Montreal. She's Catholic. She moves to Mackinac with her husband. She becomes very prominent in the Catholic Church on Mackinac Island. She is given an Ojibwe name, and she's godmother to, we're estimating right now in the records, about 116 children in the course of her lifetime. Interestingly, this couple is married in Montreal in an Anglican church. So, who are they really? Are you going to label them, how do we label them then in historical records? Because they do have a very interesting life. If we focus on the labels that we currently have of race and culture, we miss who they are. And this doesn't just happen in the case of founding Métis families or even in Métis families. And so I'm giving the example of Chief Poundacre from the Saskatchewan area, who's one of the famous chiefs in 1885. He's known as a Cree chief. His mother is a Belanger from Alacross, Saskatchewan. He is adopted by Chief Crowfoot of the Blackfoot Nation, and he dies on the Blackfoot, in one of the Blackfoot reserves, 1886, 1887, I'm not exactly sure of the year, after being released from Stony Mountain Penitentiary for his role in 1885. We herald him as a Cree chief, and that's absolutely what he is. But he's also the adopted son of the Blackfoot Nation. he was building an alliance with the Blackfeet people, and he is as much Blackfoot as a result of his adoption as he is Cree. He's also part Métis. His mother is Métis from Malacrosse. So how do we label him, and how do we understand who he is? He doesn't leave us any records that he writes that identifies him, where he says, I am this. But his pattern of life behavior tells us a story, not just of him as an individual, but of the society in which he lives, where traditional adoption into other nations, into other tribes, is expected, and it's a part of a political process of alliance building. And we see these things within Métis communities because we pull from that same sort of tradition. And so back to the Solomons in this area. These are the children of Ezekiel and Louise Solomon. They are all born in Montreal, but they are brought by their parents to the Michilimackinac area. This is where they are raised. This is where they live their lives. This is where they eventually die. And they marry in with local people. Their wives and husbands are both Ojibwe and perhaps Métis. So Samuel gets married. Ezekiel and William are the two best known men in that family. Ezekiel Jr. is a voyageur and a trader at Drummond Island, and later ends up at Lake Nipigon, running several of the Hudson's Bay Company posts in the Lake Nipigon region. William marries several times and is known as a British interpreter at Sault Ste. Marie. There are also Solomons in Detroit and Chicago that descend from the Solomon family that we see here. Like their mother, Elizabeth and Sophie Solomon serve as godmothers within the Michilimackinac church records. And so as their mother is becoming quite interconnected with people through this role as godmother, so too are the daughters. This is the godchildren network of Louise Dubois. These are the 116 people that she stands in as godmother to. She's right in the center, the red center dot in the middle, and the three other red dots. The two closest to her are the daughters, and one further away is a granddaughter. And you start to see this network of people radiating out. What we've started to do is use this kind of charting system. This is social networking. It's social networking software. It's free software on the web. I don't know anything about it. I have a grad student who's a genius. So this is her job. I turn over the data and she enters it all in. We don't create this cluster. This is simply about entering data into fields and then waiting for the pattern to appear. And this is the pattern that appears. So we haven't manipulated it to create Louise in the center with all of these people coming out. That's the way the program radiates outward from one individual. So we've started playing with social networking to see if we can see a worldview. If we can start to map and chart the patterns of relationships between people. And the data that we collected for this comes entirely from the Michilimackinac records, the church records on Mackinac Island. This is the same kind of graph. It's still the Solomon women. It's still Louise and her daughters and her granddaughter. But what we see is the move from Mackinac Island to Penetanguishene. And the yellow and gray on the one side is what starts at Mackinac, and everything that moves into the blue represents what's happening at Penetanguishene and what we can find in the Penetang church records. So the cluster starts to radiate outwards now into two communities. As these women are aging, as they've had children, as their children are having children, and as they're physically relocating to other communities in the local region. And they're moving for very obvious reasons. This is the movement of posts. They're moving to where the work is, where their husbands are, and where the economy is now being based. So when I started this years ago, I started trying to use genealogies. And I've always been quite frustrated by genealogies. I don't know my own very well, my sisters do that work. But I started looking at records for northern Saskatchewan to chart the community in northern Saskatchewan. The problem with genealogies as a method is that typically what we do is we start in the present and we work our way backward through generations to find, you know, the big moment where we find the one ancestor that is Métis, right? And then we hope that that means something. And this is what everybody does. I mean, genealogy is a multi-million-dollar industry now. There's genealogy websites everywhere. You can download free software. Everybody has somebody in their family who's doing this, and they talk incessantly at dinner about this. That's my sister. Okay, I try to not do this, but it probably slips out. But it's never about my family. It's always about everybody else's. But it's a very limited view, because it really all it does is it traces maybe 2 patrolines at most. Typically what we do is we trace ourselves through our surname. Our surnames always come from our male line. It's a very European style structure of paternity. And we maybe will trace our mother's line, but they're not really our family because we don't share the same surname all the time. So often we just concentrate on our dads, our grandfathers, our great-grandfathers. And so we miss half of the family. Well, we probably miss more than half. We miss probably 2/3 of our family. We've left out women. We've left out our cousins. We've left out our aunts and uncles. And we've left out all of those people that they're related to that we have some sort of social connection to in our communities. We know we have a social connection if we live in a community because we interact with those people. So why have we left them out of the tree? So really all this shows is one direct kinship line. It does not represent social relationships, and it can't. That's not why it was created. And then we take, this is a tree, this is the Trachi family actually from just south of where I'm from in Saskatoon. I started tracing them a while ago. Turns out there's Trachis in this region too, so perhaps there's some relatives going on, I'm not sure. But this is what it looks like, right? And it's very flat, it's one-dimensional, and it really doesn't tell us that much. What it does show us, there's darkened men's names. Those are men who are working together in a brigade. They're buffalo hunters. This is a male network of labor. And they're all married to La Flamboise women. So we took this and we put it in social networking software. The center cluster are the La Flamboise women. 3 sisters and a mother who hold that buffalo hunting group together over multi-generations is La Flamboise women. If we trace the male fur traders or buffalo hunters, we miss them completely. We don't know that what's at the core of this community are women, but more importantly, a very specific group of related women. So it's the same data, but what the social networking software allows us to do is reinterpret it and to actually see a community start to emerge. We can also start tracking locations this way. So if we start entering the data about where people are, what this is showing you is dead center again is their community, Round Prairie. It's just south of Saskatoon today. Off to one side is St. Francois Xavier Parish in Red River, heading down. We're heading down into Montana. This is a group that's on the move. And so we can start tracking how they move based on who they're married to, who they're adopting, and the locations that we're picking them up in the records through. The thing about tracking Métis in any capacity, whether it's genealogically or whether it's by location, is that, and I don't care where people are located in what part of this country, these are people who are on the move. The fur trade is a mobile economy. Buffalo hunting is a mobile economy. Tripping on the boat brigades is a mobile economy. These people move through multiple record groups in a year. So I can't, for this particular population, I can't look at one post and pull all of the names out. we're now looking at about 20 posts that we have to check through just to track what we thought was one small brigade of people. The same thing is true in the Great Lakes. And I'll get to that slide in a minute. But what the social networking has allowed us to start seeing is that the traditional genealogical approach that we've done for the last 20, 25 years is inadequate to being able to tell us anything about social relationships, and it's just too basic. Genealogical charts are also limited because of the sheer amount of data. One of the things genealogies don't allow us to do is track godparents. We know everybody was baptized, we know everybody has godparents, we have all of those records, but there's no way to enter that into a genealogical chart. And yet, we all know that godparents serve an important social function in Catholic communities. And so what are the patterns? Who's being picked? You know, I don't think it's a surprise that Louise Dubois has 116 godchildren. This is an important woman. This is a woman that people clearly look to as somebody who was a leader in that community. It didn't matter that she was a French-Canadian woman born in Montreal. She had integrated herself into that community, as evidenced by the fact that they've also given her an Ojibwe name. And that name loosely translates, I'm working with a Soto elder right now, but loosely we're at a translation of she's a powerful woman, she's a leader. Ogama, Esqueo. We're uncertain what the middle part of her name is right now. We're still working on that. Thunderbird? So you think she's Thunderbird woman? Yeah. So this is an important woman. That name is it's not an accident, right? Because the importance of godmothers is not an accident. And I think what you're seeing here is the melding of two worldviews that are recreating who Louise Dubois is in those records. But social networking allows us to see something different and to look at different social realities. And so if we start taking that kind of social networking modeling and moving it into the Great Lakes, we have to look at the southern side of the Great Lakes. We have to look at the American record groups. We have the American Fur Company records, we have the Jesuit records, we have census records of the Americans, but we also have something really interesting. They're called the half-breed rolls in the United States. But if we only focus on the upper Great Lakes, we miss the families because this is a mobile economy. And just because the Northwest Company disappears in 1821 does not mean there's only one trade company to work for. The Americans have multiple trade companies coming in on the southern side of the Great Lakes. The American Fur Company is the most dominant. And everybody probably from this region knows how easily people cross those lakes and move back and forth. The same thing happens in the West where I'm from. Anybody who lives along the Canadian-US border knows that people are constantly moving back and forth even now. We know where the access points are to avoid American customs. You know, so that we have to ignore these borders because these borders belong to nation states. They do not belong to Métis or First Nations people. What they do is they serve to provide our citizenship and cut us off from a full understanding of our own histories. So in the United States, as Jason said earlier, he spoke of script really briefly. In Canada, the Canadian government issued script to half-breeds in Western Canada. In the United States, they embarked on a similar process, but under their treaty regime. It wasn't a separate system. It's very much under their treaty regime. And I don't fully understand it yet. We've only just started exploring those records.